In Essential Task 7.3, we are going to describe the process of operant conditioning, a topic which we're going to talk about in Concept Maps 7.3, 7.4, and 7.5. I will like to point out that the region of the concept map labeled reinforcement and punishment is a little bit shorter than you might anticipate. The boxes either have a positive or negative symbol and just a little bit of text. So although this looks like a really long concept map, the region here in the middle might be shorter than you anticipate. Nevertheless, we will return back to the concept map text, allow you to copy down the portion in yellow before proceeding into the concept map. The concept of operant conditioning is in many ways a byproduct of the work of two separate psychologists. So we're going to introduce someone named Edward Thorndike, and then in the upcoming box talk about an individual named B.F. Skinner. Thorndike's work came first, thus we'll talk about him first. We will also give him a green key psychologist icon. Thorndike is one of those psychologists that gets credited for identifying and publishing what is in many ways a pretty self-explanatory and almost obvious idea. Thorndike's principle, also known as the law of effect, very simply says that if the behavior is followed by a favorable consequence, then that behavior becomes more likely to occur. So, for example, if a teacher rewards you with candy when you raise your hand to contribute to class, you're more likely to continue raising your hand, assuming you consider candy to be a favorable consequence. If you get praised every time you help somebody at school, that behavior would be more likely to occur. Then the opposite is true. If a behavior is followed by an unfavorable consequence, that behavior is less likely to occur. If you get a speeding ticket for speeding on the highway, according to Thorndike's principle, also known as the law of effect, you are simply going to be less likely to speed on the highway going forward because obviously getting a ticket is an unfavorable consequence. This very basic, simple concept known as the law of effect is in many ways the underlying principles of what we're about to talk about in regards to operant conditioning. Proceeding onward, we're going to introduce operant conditioning. I will point out that this box has some text below, so do not close this box once you're finished copying this down. Operant conditioning is most closely associated with key psychologist B.F. Skinner. There's a high likelihood that B.F. Skinner appears on the AP exam, so I gave him 3 key psychologist icons. Skinner proposed that learning occurs when behaviors are done willingly by choice in order to earn a reward or avoid a punishment. So, for example, if you choose to do your homework, you are willingly by choice either trying to earn a good grade or perhaps avoid punishment or discipline from a parent or guardian, or even in some cases, the school. You are willingly making the decision on your own accord to earn that reward or avoid the punishment. That differs considerably from what we talked about in the first 2 concept maps of this unit, with Essential Task 7.1 and 7.2. That classical conditioning flowchart, on the other hand, argues that behaviors are automatic, that when a dog salivates to a bell, they're not willingly by choice choosing to salivate. It happens automatically. That is the complete opposite of what we're talking about here. This might do a much better job explaining how you, for example, teach a dog a trick. If you have taught dog tricks before, perhaps sitting or rolling over or giving you their paw, you've probably done so by rewarding them with a treat. Well, those animals are willingly by choice carrying out those tricks, sitting, rolling over, giving you their paw in order to earn a reward. They underwent operant conditioning. Or perhaps there's a behavior at home. Maybe you don't want your cat to scratch certain aspects of your home, maybe certain furniture, and you spray them with water or shake something that produces a loud sound or clap. Well, perhaps in the future, that cat will willingly by choice avoid the behaviors in which they've been punished for doing, because obviously cats don't want to get sprayed with water or hear loud sounds. So they might avoid scratching your couch going forward. Those are both examples of operant conditioning. Being rewarded for doing tricks, being punished for scratching parts of the house that you don't want them to scratch. Skinner is most often associated with a study called either the Skinner's box or the operant chamber. Do watch the entirety of the clip here to the left. I will, of course, attach this to Google Classroom as well. In the Skinner box, animals were taught specific target behaviors when immediately rewarded with food. So, for example, mice might learn to, or rats might learn to pull a lever in their environment if that behavior led to the immediate release of food. And of course, if they are rewarded with food, they're going to continue that behavior. Pigeons learn to peck at little red discs on the walls. They learn to turn around, which might sound somewhat surprising. So do watch that clip to see that. So whether if it was pulling a lever down, a pigeon poking a little red disc on the wall, pigeons learning to turn around, kind of spin around as if they were doing a trick, all of those were examples of very specific target behaviors that were taught to these organisms because they were immediately rewarded with one of the most powerful motivators and one of the most powerful reinforcers, food. They specifically underwent a process called shaping. Shaping occurs when an organism is rewarded when they're getting closer and closer to the target behavior in which you're trying to teach. So, for example, those rats may have been, or those mice may have been roaming around their cage or their box or their chamber and just casually touched the lever. And the next thing you know, a piece of food falls out. And that mouse or rat might look at the piece of food and say, wow, how did that happen? It seems to have happened when I touched this lever. Maybe I'll touch the lever again. But now maybe the second time no food comes out. And they're confused and they say, all right, well, maybe I got to touch this lever differently. And next thing you know, they push down on it a little bit. And next thing you know, a piece of food comes out. And in order to successfully teach this target behavior, obviously it's hard for a mouse to just suddenly pull a lever down automatically. You need to do the process of shaping where you incrementally reward the organism as they get closer and closer to the target behavior. We call that rewarding through successive approximations. Maybe someday you're going to teach your children to tie their shoes and the whole process might be challenging, but maybe the first time they cross the laces properly, you cheer them, you praise them. Well, praise is a reward. And then the next time they, loop the laces properly, you can praise them again. And as you incrementally praise them leading up to fully tying their shoes, you're using the process of shaping. Maybe someday you're going to teach your child to play the piano. And obviously they're not going to play like a world-renowned pianist on the first day, but maybe they do something properly. Or maybe they just even sit up properly and you say, good job, or you reward them with a piece of candy. And then as they incrementally build up how well they can play the piano, the notes that they can play, their form, etc., you can use shaping by rewarding them with successive approximations until they actually do the target behavior that you want. This phenomenon of shaping can be used to explain the behavior of the animals in the Skinner's box, but can also be used to explain teaching somebody how to tie their shoes, play the piano, or really just about anything. It's the idea that you might not reward somebody for doing the entire target behavior. That target behavior might be very involved, but you progressively reward them bit by bit as they get closer and closer to that target behavior. In terms of Skinner terminology, and I guess before we get to Skinner terminology, I should note we're going to try our best to do a demo of this. So if you're in class, you can reflect on that demo that we're going to try and do. The next portion of this concept map are the boxes that you currently see. We need to differentiate between what's called reinforcement and punishment, and then talk specifically here at the bottom about different types of reinforcement. I would like you to copy down sort of this 4-box table. You can combine these two columns so that it's one giant box with four quadrants, or you can separate it. That's totally fine too. It's important, though, on the left, under reinforcement, to put both things that you see here. It says given after desirable target behavior. Reinforcement, this entire left column, is only provided to an organism after the target behavior is done. Only. Over here it says given after undesirable target behavior. This is clearly, this column here, differentiating punishment. So it's very important, this box here that you see where it says given after desirable target behavior and given after undesirable target behavior. I will be checking your concept maps to make sure this box is included, because it's really important that what we're about to talk about on the left is only provided to an organism, only after they've done a behavior that you want, never anything else. Punishment is only given after a behavior that you do not want. That's a very critical element of what we're about to talk about. And if you're going to do the two columns, as I am recommending here, the second thing I want you to take into consideration is you'll notice here on the sides the words reinforcement and punishment to differentiate the columns, and the words positive and negative to differentiate the rows. I think that's a proper way of differentiating what we're about to talk about. We're going to first talk here on the top left side and talk about what's called positive reinforcements. We're going to combine, obviously, the row name and the column name. Then when we do these, you're going to notice that there's a symbol that appears. This blue positive plus sign connected with the word positive. When you use positive reinforcement, you are providing the organism with something that they desire. So that's what this addition sign here is indicating, adding something desirable. So when you've given your dog a treat or your cat a treat, or you've praised somebody, or you've given somebody a piece of candy because they've done something that you want, something that warrants a reinforcer, you've used what's called positive reinforcement. The word reinforcement is essentially a synonym for reward, though technically in Skinner terminology, we're going to use the word reinforcement. The College Board might not necessarily consider reinforcement and reward perfect synonyms on an FRQ, so use the word reinforcement, although that might not be previously a term that you've used in your vocabulary. So positive reinforcement. We're adding something desirable in the aftermath of doing a target behavior. And that part is so critical, in the aftermath. You don't just give somebody a piece of candy for no reason. If you're a teacher, you don't just give candy for no reason. You give candy after a student has answered a question. You give students candy after they've done their homework. You give students candy after they've been respectful in class. It has to be after the target behavior. After. So critical. Same is true with negative reinforcement. And terminology-wise, this might sound really weird. The word negative, previously, you associate with something that is bad. Totally concede that. Negative reinforcement, though, is actually a good thing. That word reinforcement indicates that it's a desirable thing. You want as much reinforcement in your life as possible, positive and negative. In Skinner terminology, now that you've seen both of these, that word positive or negative means one of two things. Either something has been added to the life of the organism or something has been subtracted from the life of the organism. The word negative means something has been subtracted from the life of the organism. Negative reinforcement is when something undesirable has been taken away from the life of the organism. And obviously, if you get rid of something that you do not want, something that you do not like, the end result is that you're going to have this green smiley face. You're going to be happy. The most classic example of negative reinforcement is when you take aspirin or a pain reliever to get rid of a headache. Obviously, you don't want to have headaches. When you have a headache and you take a painkiller, it gets rid of the undesirable. As a result, according to Skinner theory, the next time you have a headache, you're going to take a painkiller. Why? Because the last time you did it, it got rid of your headache. That taught you that the outcome of taking a painkiller when you have a headache is the removal of the headache. Now you are willingly, by choice, going to seek out that reward or that reinforcement of removing the headache. And you are going to experience, again, a second case of negative reinforcement when you take that painkiller and it gets rid of the undesirable. That's the key. Reinforcement, and it's even true with punishment, but reinforcement always comes after a behavior. Positive reinforcement, let's say you're trying to teach a student to raise their hand in class. If you praise them after they do that target behavior, they're going to continue to seek out that reward, that reinforcement. They'll continue to raise their hand in class. If you take aspirin in order to get rid of a headache, that desirable outcome happens after the target behavior of using aspirin. It teaches you of the consequence of using aspirin, and now the next time it happens, you're going to seek out that reinforcement of removing a headache. Even though that terminology, negative reinforcement, sounds a little unusual, again, it's absolutely a good thing. Notice the green smiley faces on the left. That's not going to be the case on the right. So, for example, word positive, as we've established, means something's been added. Punishment's not a good thing. Punishment is obviously a bad thing. You never want to be punished. Positive punishment, I know it sounds weird. Positive punishment is when you've added something that is clearly undesirable as a consequence of a behavior. So, for example, a student talks back. You give that student a detention. A student cheats. You give that student a detention. Now that student can associate that behavior of cheating with the clear consequence. And now going forward, according to Skinner theory, according to Skinner terminology, that student is willingly, by choice, going to avoid that type of punishment in the future and cheat less. The whole point of punishment is to whittle away a behavior, make it less and less likely to occur, hopefully totally eliminating it from the behavioral pattern of the organism. The other type of punishment is what we call negative punishment. So again, negative in Skinner terminology means something's being taken away. If a teacher takes away your phone for talking in class, or even for using it in class, they're illustrating what's called negative punishment. They're taking away something that you clearly desire. that you clearly want. And obviously the end result is going to be this upset face here at the bottom. The last thing to talk about is to just distinguish between the two types of reinforcers that you can use. If you're going to provide reinforcement to an organism, there's either primary reinforcement or a secondary reinforcement. Just so that you're familiar that this term can be used interchangeably, I've labeled these boxes primary reinforcer and secondary reinforcer, though do note that when they use the word reinforcer, it's in reference to the concept of reinforcement that we just established above. This is very similar to the terms primary drive and secondary drive back in the motivation unit. It's actually really an exact transition between that concept and this concept. So if you remember that concept, this is the exact same thing. Primary reinforcers are innately reinforcing stimuli like food and water. Organisms do not need to learn to want food or water. Therefore, those are incredibly powerful reinforcers. So if you provide food to an organism like a dog while trying to train them, that's an incredibly powerful positive reinforcer. I'm going to give you food. Secondary reinforcers are things that you have to learn to want. So I'm talking about things like money is probably the most commonly cited secondary reinforcer. Praise, grades, recognition, those are all secondary reinforcers. You have to learn to want money. You have to learn to want recognition. You have to learn to want praise. Those can be powerful. Certainly in some conditions, they're incredibly powerful. But typically primary reinforcers are considered more powerful because you don't have to learn it. They are innately reinforcing in and of themselves.